Frydenberg, thanks for joining me. First of all, how many workers will lose their jobs directly or indirectly from Hazelwood being closed?
Well, 700 have lost their jobs at Hazelwood, and that is a very sad day for the people in the Latrobe Valley and across Victoria. And I had the opportunity to visit those workers not that long ago, and obviously we are working hard to ensure that there are other opportunities for them. But clearly the impact of the closure of Hazelwood is significant. It's significant on energy supply, and it's also significant on energy affordability.
Well, let's start with the affordability thing. What effect do you think this will have on power prices?
Well, the best advice comes from the Australian Energy Market Commission, and they say that the average household across the national electricity market will see their electricity prices increase by $78 over the next year. It will come down after that as more generation comes into the market, but it certainly will have an upward impact on prices.
Now, the Australian Energy Market Operator has said that this closure means Victoria now faces 72 days of possible power supply shortfalls over the next 2 years. 72 days over 2 years. But at the same time, it claims that there's enough power to stop blackouts of the kind we've seen in South Australia. How do those two statements square with each other?
Well, the reference to the 72 days is the result of a weekly forecast that is put out by the Australian Energy Market Operator based on the assumption there's no new generation. It's effectively sending a signal to the market to get ready for 1 in 10 year events where they will need to put more energy into the market. So obviously, as a result of reports like that, other generators prepare themselves to put more electrons into the system. So for example, in New South Wales, Liddell is a 2,000 megawatt black coal-fired power station, only runs at around 43% capacity. Erang is another coal-fired power station in New South Wales, which has 2,800 megawatts of capacity. It runs at only around 60%. So as a result of AEMO putting out that information, other generators will come into the market, and that statement from AEMO about those 72 days predates the announcement that we received today from Engie, the owner of Pelican Point, a gas-fired power station in South Australia, that they will now come on permanently, and that's another 240 megawatts into the system. So you can't look at it at a point in time. You have to understand that it really is sending a signal to the market to increase their generation to cater for those times of peak demand.
But from what you're saying, so we get Pelican Point, which is gas-fired, coming in as a result of a shortage caused in large part by Hazelwood, we are actually facing a cheap form of power generation with a more expensive one, and that's why power prices are going up, correct?
Well, certainly the various forms of power have different prices attached, and gas is more expensive than brown coal-fired power out of Hazelwood. Now, we have to understand that right today, as you and I are sitting here talking, the demand in Victoria is around 5,000 megawatts. Now, over the last summer that we've just experienced, the peak demand was around 8,500 megawatts. Post Hazelwood, there is still around 11,000 or just under 11,000 megawatts of generation in Victoria, and that's not even allowing for the interconnectors from both New South Wales and Tasmania. So, Andrew, you're right. The situation does become tighter as a result of the closure of Hazelwood, and you're right, the prices do go up. But according to AEMO, there is sufficient excess generation in the market for the system to manage that development.
So you can guarantee then that there will be no blackouts as a result of Hazelwood closing?
I can only rely on the best advice to the government from the Australian Energy Market Operator, and they are saying that the system will manage through times of peak demand, which will be the summer at the end of this year and the times in early next year. Now, we've been very critical of the Victorian government because ultimately they have to take responsibility for the supply of energy and electricity in their own state, and they tripled the royalties the coal royalties on the operators in the Latrobe Valley, which meant that Engie and Mitsui, the owners of Hazelwood, had additional pressure on their balance sheet. They've also adopted the 40% renewable energy target in Victoria, way above what we see at the federal level, and of course that's an increased impost on consumers, whether they're households and businesses. And we've also seen a ban on non-conventional gas extraction in Victoria and a moratorium on conventional gas extraction in Victoria, which has made it much more difficult and more expensive to get gas for the manufacturers and the households in Victoria who rely on it. So I have to point the finger at the Victorian government for their behaviour over energy policy.
Well, I did note that you couldn't guarantee yourself that, or wouldn't, that there would be no power blackouts as a result of this. But listen, I see politicians crying crocodile tears about Hazelwood closing, all those jobs lost, etc., etc. But isn't putting power stations like Hazelwood, coal-fired ones, out of business the whole point of renewable energy targets, whether it's the Victorian one of 40% or yours of 23%?
Well, it's certainly prefaced on the idea of a transition across the electricity system and to get a change in the fuel mix. And right now across Australia, electricity, about 60% of our electricity comes from coal-fired power. And if you talk about just the national electricity market, it's currently as high as 75%. So we are very reliant on coal-fired power. At the same time,
I know that, but the whole point of this renewable energy target is to make us less reliant on coal. It actually is to close stations like Hazelwood. Isn't that the exact purpose of your energy target, and even more to the point, Labor's energy target?
Well, it's stating a point of the obvious to say, as you see more renewable energy come into the market, you're going to see a displacement of the existing thermal generation. Now,
so
our goal is to ensure that the market remains as stable as possible and that prices remain affordable. That's why we've rejected a higher 50% renewable energy target that we've seen from the Labor Party. But I've said to you before in your program, the renewable energy target does cost consumers. It does cost consumers around $60
and it costs 700 people their jobs. That's the whole point here. But Josh, about that, right? And I know I keep badgering you about this. I know you never give me an answer. I'm only going to ask it the once so we can... But listen, the whole point of closing Hazelwood in turn is to cut the world's temperature, obviously. That's what the whole game is, to stop global warming. What can you tell those 700 workers who this week lost their jobs about the point of this sacrifice? How much will this closure cut the world's temperature by?
Well, as you know, we have signed up to reduce our emissions by 26 to 28%, and we're part of a global effort to reduce the temperature increases by less than 2 degrees and ideally by
but everyone asked,
degrees.
Look, but Josh, I said only one question, I'll make it 2, because everyone heard me ask the question. Everyone heard you shift the answer, because the answer is 0. I'll ask once more, you can contradict me if I'm wrong. How much will the closure of Hazelwood change the world's temperature by? What difference has the jobs of these 700 people thrown on the scrap heap made to the climate?
Well, we are part of a global effort, and that effort is making headway in reducing emissions. Now,
okay,
for
the answer's none.
Nothing I say
the answer's
will
none.
Please you on that one, Andrew.
No, because I want an answer, and the answer's none, and everyone can hear it. But anyway, listen, your new Snowy scheme, right, that was announced a couple of weeks ago, which is to pump electricity uphill from one dam to a higher one during off-peak periods to make hydroelectricity when it comes down again during peak demand. Essentially a giant battery.
Yes. Yes.
You are going to be spending $2 billion on that scheme, when updating Hazelwood to keep it running for years more would, according to the owners, cost 1/5 of that, $400 million. To produce, it's almost the same amount of electricity. Why wouldn't you spend $400 million rather than $2 billion?
Well, Hazelwood was a 50-year-old power station, and to go back to your previous question, it was a brown coal-fired power station which produced up to 1,400 kilograms of CO2 per megawatt hour produced. What we're talking about with Snowy Hydro is using a pumped hydro system to create renewable energy and stable power. Now, we can debate the issue about whether or not we should be reducing emissions and by how much, but ultimately a plan like Snowy Hydro significantly reduces emissions from the overall electricity market and electricity generation than Hazelwood does.
So it comes down again to the global warming scare. Josh Frydenberg, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Andrew.